The other day, I came across this statistic from the Cultural Research Center and overseen by George Barna, and it listed that 37%, only 37% of pastors have a quote biblical worldview, and 62% of pastors. Here's where the statistic is listed. 62% of pastors have a quote hybrid worldview, which they call syncretism. Now, this, of course, would sound alarming to many conservative evangelical Christians. And statistics like this, research like this, helps raise the profile of the institutions, in this case, of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. It puts them in the media, it gives them the media spotlight. And I'm just going to say it. I mean, it's obviously going to help with things like funding, interest in the school. So the more dramatic you can come up with in terms of a statistic, the more dramatic the statistic, the more alarming, then the better for the institution and the center that produces the statistic, because it gets interest in the school. Now, I'm not saying by any means that the Cultural Research Center and George Barna are driven to come up with what are alarming statistics in order to raise the profile of the center and the school and their research, but it's a factor. You should keep in mind that it's a factor. Now, in terms of the actual research being done here, I can't come across within this report how they define a biblical worldview, except to note a couple things. First of all, that they say this is reasoning based on biblical principles, and any combination of reasoning in your worldview. Oh, let me pause to that. So let's actually go here. So is reasoning based upon biblical principles on all of these topics right here. So we have purpose or calling, your understanding of family value in life, God, creation, history, faith, practices, sin, salvation, God, human nature, lifestyle, behavior, relationships, and the Bible, truth, and morals. To have a biblical worldview, according to Barna and their research, is to reason based upon biblical principles alone in all of these areas. But if you draw upon some other way of thinking that is external to the Bible, you are automatically saddled with the label of a syncretist, and you no longer have a biblical worldview. Now, I'm sorry, but this is nonsense. The way that a Christian forms, first of all, the way that a Christian forms their beliefs, should form their beliefs, is by way of building a Christian worldview. A Christian worldview, and if you're a Protestant, what that means is that it's critically informed by a commitment to the authority of Scripture, sola scriptura. But sola scriptura has never meant Scripture is the sole source of the principles by which one forms their worldview. That's not sola scriptura. That's low church fundamentalist biblicism, which is very popular, sadly, in North America. Sola scriptura is the idea that Scripture is the norming norm for theological reflection, that source, norm, lodestar, guide, lighthouse by which you bring other sources. But those other sources or principles can also inform your worldview. And it's a complex process of reflective equilibrium in building a worldview in critical dialogue between Scripture and those other sources. Other sources can be things like in the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, for example, the tradition that informs you, because you always read Scripture through a tradition and the principles of that tradition, or the experiences you have, which you have to process theologically, and you bring those experiences to Scripture and read Scripture in light of the experiences and that others have. And the reasoning that you use, the philosophical arguments you make, the scientific arguments that you make are all part of your reasoning processes. So you bring all of this together and you're seeking to develop a Christian worldview. So Barna prejudices you against developing an actual Christian worldview, which is a mature way of thinking that Christianity is the pursuit of an integrated worldview between Scripture and all of these other sources. And he labels that syncretism and says instead, no, you should only reason based upon the Bible. And if you don't have a biblical worldview. And he says only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview by this definition, and 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview by this definition. So I just say your definition of what a Christian should have in terms of worldview is bad. Your labels like syncretism are bad. The resulting outputs you get in terms of 37% of pastors only have a worldview, biblical worldview, that's bad. So the good news is this, that you don't have to be afraid of, this is not an alarming statistic that only 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview. All it does is show us that Barna's research is very poor, and the assumptions that undergird it are bad. One of the things he defines as a worldview is postmodernism. I mean, postmodernism is not a worldview. Postmodernism is a diverse coalition of philosophical interests. There's no coherent worldview that is postmodern. And then he says like Marxism is a worldview and secular humanism is a worldview. He lists like 7 different worldviews, as he says, and then any combination of Christianity with those is syncretistic. The whole methodology is flawed fundamentally. But what this does do at the end of the day is it gives you an alarming statistic. Only 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview. And then that helps to raise the profile of the center that produced the results and the university that funds the center. And it helps conservative evangelicals build their sort of fundamentalist countercultural movement where they are a bastion against the secular forces of the world around them as they seek to build a biblical worldview. But beyond that, it's just not helpful research.